kind of a bluish color there, they have the highest numeracy skills. And as you can see, that is only about 9% of people, but a full 30% of people are at or below level 1, which is the lowest level of numeracy skills in the study. So how do someone's numeracy skills affect their understanding of health information? Well, basically, someone who has trouble understanding numbers in health materials will probably have trouble understanding those health materials. So the question then is, should we just leave numbers out of health materials? Well, sometimes we can do that, but often we can't. There are, of course, many situations where there are numbers that people need to understand in order to make informed decisions for their health. So how do we help people understand numbers? Well, just like we can use plain language whenever possible, we can also use numbers in a way that increases understanding and also in a way that helps us meet our communication goal. And if you listened to Brian and Jessica's presentation just before this, then you already know a little bit about the importance of considering your communication goal when you're including numbers in a health material. And we will also talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. All right, and then first let's take a quick look at some content that is from a government fact sheet on fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. So as you can see here, there are lots of numbers in this very small amount of text, and this is not unusual. We see this type of content a lot. So when we look at this, we are interested in questions like, how might these numbers in this material affect people's understanding? Are there too many numbers in this material? And then are these numbers in the best possible format to increase understanding? Before we take a look at our research though, Sandy is going to just walk us through a few tools that provide numeracy guidance for people who create health materials. Sandy, are you muted?
Sorry, unmuting. I think it's helpful to set the context a little bit with talking a little bit about the guidance and what is out there. So to start, I'm going to go through a few tools. In 1 second, let me just change my view over here on my notes. Okay, so many of the tools that exist around clear communication guidance don't have a lot of numeracy information in them, but there are some that do, and I want to talk about a few just to give you a context of what the guidance is right now. So I'm going to preview these three, the Clear Communication Index, the PMAT, and the SAM, just to give you a sense of what's in the guidance. Next slide. So first I'm going to talk about the Clear Communication Index, which was developed by CDC, obviously, and spearheaded by Cynthia Bauer when she was there at CDC. And in the Clear Communication Index, there's actually 3 numeracy items. And the first one is this here. So does the material always present numbers that the primary audience uses? And obviously that is open to a little bit of interpretation. One of the things that the CDC Index talks about is making sure you're doing research with your target audience to make sure that you understand what they do understand about the numbers and what their preferences are. Some other guidance that they include in this is making sure you use numbers that are only numbers that are necessary to support your main message. So this harkens back to what Jessica and Brian talked about earlier today, if you attended that presentation. And then thinking about using numbers in common terms. And what they mean by that is things like decimals, fractions, percentages at times can be confusing or not easy to interpret. Next slide. The second numeracy item in the Clear Communication Index is does the material always explain what the numbers mean? So this part is really about the context. Again, numbers mean different things to different people. So are you giving them like, is this number high or low, for example? How do you frame that number so they can put it into context and understand what it means using qualitative descriptors, etc. And then the next one is, does the audience have to conduct mathematical calculations? That's pretty straightforward. You don't want your reader to be doing math. So in the CDC index, it talks about, for example, you don't want people to have to calculate their own BMI. You want to keep denominators consistent across numbers in the same material so you can do easy comparisons, that kind of thing. So that's the CDC Clear Communication Index. And then you're going to see some similar things in these other instruments that I want to talk about next. So the next one I want to preview is the PMAP-P, which is the Patient Education Materials Assessment. And that comes out of ARC. And I'm going to try to define all my acronyms today, as this is a health literacy conference, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. And Cindy Brock there at ARC really spearheaded this effort. And there's some similar pieces. So in the PMAP-P, the guidance there in terms of numeracy is one, only using numbers only as needed. So again, this is, does it support the main message? Do you need them or not? There's some interpretation there, of course. It also recommends using frequencies instead of percentages. So that's like 1 out of 10 instead of 10%. And CDC index talks about this a little bit, although it gives you a little bit more latitude there in terms of frequency versus percentages. And then again, the context, explaining numbers qualitatively, putting in a context, giving people information to interpret the number. So some similarities between PMAP-P and CDC index. All of these, were really developed based on the same numeracy literature. So you see some of that overlap. And then on the next slide, you can see just an example of a BMI calculation chart. Obviously, most people use the calculator for a good reason, because you don't want people to have to try to figure this out themselves. And then the final one is the SAM. And this one is, SAM stands for the Suitability Assessment of Materials. And the original SAM, which was developed by Lynn and CC Doak, did not include any numeracy items. They added this additional component, the Comprehensibility Assessment of Materials item, the CAM, to this. And again, you see some similarities in what we just talked about. So using numbers that aren't fractions, percents, or probabilities. So typically whole numbers and frequencies is what's being recommended across these tools. Context, words, so, less than and more than, but also just in general, is this number big or small? And again, all three of those instruments we just talked about do not make the reader do calculations. So that is super consistent across the guidance for numeracy. Okay, so that preview kind of gives you a sense of what's out there and kind of sets us up for what we were trying to do and what really we're going to focus on today. So our goal was part of a larger project with the National Library of Medicine, that's just NLM in this slide. And NLM was really wanting to take existing guidance, primarily from the PMAP-P is what they started from, but they wanted to prioritize and clarify that guidance so that they could use it as requirements for easy to read materials on their consumer health websites, such as Medline Plus, which most of you are probably familiar with Medline Plus, which is NLM's very large consumer health website. It links to lots of consumer health resources across the government and trusted nonprofits. So they were really trying to hone in and nuance out the guidance. And we looked at all clear communication guidance for them. But what we're going to focus on today is just the numeracy piece of that. And the goal of that was really to help them better understand and develop more nuanced guidance connected with the PMAP-P items we just talked about when and how to use numbers in health materials. So that was really our goal, working with them. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that we did, which was really exploratory. It was really kind of a jumping off point to see if we could scratch the surface on how to make this a little bit more specific. You saw in the guidance that exists now, there's a lot of room for interpretation and some things about, using numbers that people know or understand, or only use, use numbers sparingly. We wanted to kind of dive into that a little bit more. So let's look at the research questions really quickly. Next slide. So here's what we set out. We wanted to dive in and make sure that we had pulled together the best practices for communicating numbers and health materials. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but that included looking at the literature and looking at existing guidance and assessment tools, and 3 of which I just went over a second ago. And then we wanted to tease out what aspects of health numeracy contribute the most to people's understanding of health materials. So again, we were really trying to dive in a little bit more and understand, when do numbers actually contribute to the understanding of health materials. So I think we're used to, as health communicators and health literacy folks, thinking that numbers typically distract from understanding, but we wanted to see at what points did numbers really help people's understanding, actually make a message or material more clear. We also wanted to see the opposite of when numbers or particular ways we were using numbers were distracting from the clarity of the material. And what context, we know context is important to interpreting numbers, but how much context, what kind of context? So we wanted to dive into that a little bit more. So that was what we set out to do. And you can go to the next slide. So our first step was really to dig into the existing guidance, as I mentioned. So we did a literature scan and we looked across guidance and existing clear communication tools, as I just chatted about. We also spoke with Jessica Anker, which, if you went to her presentation before, obviously is a numeracy subject matter expert. So we went to her and talked to her a little bit about, what are your outstanding questions? Where do you feel like the literature is really solid, and where do you feel like there could be more research? So we did that. We ended up looking closely at 14 different clear communication health literacy assessment tools and guidance. Not all of those had numeracy in them, but I mentioned this was a larger project, but we did look at a number of assessment tools. And we also looked at a number of articles on numeracy, on communicating numbers. And based on that, we really refined what our research questions were going to be to help NLM nuance out this guidance. And so part of that as well was, what are the concepts that have a lot of opportunity for learning new things? And Andrea's going to talk about that in just a second. But we also, wanted to make sure we weren't testing or exploring concepts that were just super clear. So like the calculations item that I just mentioned, there was no reason to look at that further. It's really clear you don't want to make people do math in materials if you can avoid it. So, we didn't look at that specifically. We also know things like fractions. We know decimals, other than some instances like temperature or something like that. It's pretty clear when you aren't using whole numbers or you're trying to use fractions. Again, that kind of gets into the calculation issue. So we didn't look at that. We think that's pretty clear. So we kind of honed in, what did we want to really test? And we took that to an exploratory study with 18 consumers and in-depth interviews. So we recruited 18 consumers for IDIs, or in-depth interviews. Normally, we would do a study like this in person and really see how they were reacting with the stimulus and how they were working with materials. This was done post-COVID, so all of this was done remote over Zoom. And all participants were adults who were more likely to struggle with limited health literacy skills. And what I mean by that is that we recruited participants who had some college or less, so lower in terms of education levels, who were lower income. So in general, we're looking at people who are earning $40,000 to $50,000 for a family of 4 or less. And some of that is adjusted depending on where the person lived. This was a nation. This could be done anywhere because it was done remotely. So people lived in different areas. And then also people who didn't have subject matter knowledge of the health topics that we were going to use as part of our stimulus materials. So we wanted to make sure people had low knowledge of the health topic itself. In addition to that, we also administered a 3-item health literacy measure. Most people kind of scored in the mid-range on that measure. That's a different presentation about measuring health literacy and doing it quickly and easily. So that sets up our study. And I'm going to turn over to Andrea to talk about what we tested, the concepts that we tested, and what our findings were.
All right, thank you, Sandy. So based on what we learned in that discovery phase, which Sandy just went over, we decided to explore 4 numerical health communication concepts, which you see here on this slide. So basically, these are concepts that come up often in health materials, and there isn't necessarily real clear information out there about what impact numbers have on consumers' understanding of these concepts, and then what context is needed to effectively communicate with numbers when we're using them for these 4 particular concepts. And let me just briefly explain these 4 concepts. So risk is pretty straightforward. You know, when we're talking about risk in health information materials, we're often talking about someone's risk of getting a disease or having some sort of health problem, right? By quantity, we mean how much of something. So we had an example in our study about how many tons of contaminated soil were removed from a site. So it's kind of an environmental health example. And so for the purposes of this study, tons were a quantity. So level amount, with that concept, we were basically looking at numbers that were part of a range. So specifically, think of someone's individual health measures. So like their cholesterol or triglyceride numbers, that would fall under that level amount concept. And then another example of the level amount concept would be environmental health measures. So perhaps radon levels in a home. And then with prevalence, we're talking about how many people in the population have a particular disease, health condition, et cetera. So for each of these 4 health communication concepts, we developed some brief content about 2 different topics related to health. And then we developed 2 to 3 versions of that content per topic for testing. This is all going to make more sense when you see it in a minute. But so those versions that we developed, the different versions of each for each topic, they differed by the presence or absence of numbers, as well as the presence or absence of context to help explain or represent the numbers. So for example, for prevalence, one of our examples, we developed some brief content on cystic fibrosis. And specifically, we were talking about the prevalence of cystic fibrosis in the population. So we came up with 3 slightly different versions of that content. There was one version where we included a number for prevalence. So we said about 30,000 people in the US have cystic fibrosis, but we didn't give any context. Then we had another version where we gave the context. So we said cystic fibrosis is rare, but we did not give a number with it. And then we had a version where we included both that number and the context. And then we took all the different versions of content for all these topics that we developed, and we showed our testing participants this content. And basically, so that we could figure out which were easier for them to understand and which were harder for them to understand, and then also what they liked and didn't like about those different versions of content. So we also explored 2 numeracy format concepts. Basically, we wanted to know first if people prefer ordinals spelled out or with a number, so the 2ND, and then which of those forms, if either, increases understanding. And then we had basically the same question for frequencies and percentages. Which of those do people prefer and which increases their understanding? I think where people are generally told to use frequencies. We're told that people prefer frequencies and they're easier to understand, but there isn't necessarily strong evidence about that actually. So that's why we wanted to explore that as well. All right, so now for the fun stuff, let's take a look at our findings. So our first major finding was that when it comes to whether and how to use numbers in a health material, the communication goal matters. And again, this is no surprise to you if you listened to Brian and Jessica's presentation. You heard a lot about the communication goal and what types of numbers make the most sense to include depending on what your communication goal is. So I should mention here that I know a lot of you have probably been taught to, again, avoid including numbers in health information whenever possible. But one thing that's really important to note along with this finding is that it's really not a good idea to avoid numbers for the sake of avoiding numbers. And that's where that communication goal comes into play. Depending on what your goal is, numbers could be very important. So let us go ahead and listen to an audio clip of a study participant who is discussing the content that you see on the slide. So this content here is that cystic fibrosis example that I was just telling you about.
I mean, it appears to me that they're trying to draw attention to this disease. Okay. Not that they're trying to educate people, but draw attention to it. And if you want to draw attention to something, you know, in today's monetary society, people look at big numbers as, you know, something important.
So basically, he's saying that including that number, 30,000, in this content grabs people's attention more than that version that's on the right side of your screen there, where the number isn't included. So if your communication goal is to catch people's attention and really raise awareness of something, then maybe a number can help you do that. So in our study, we definitely found that what people perceived the communication goal of the content to be affected how they interpreted the numbers and the corresponding context. So we also tested some content about heart disease, and that included the number 600,000. So basically it said that 600,000 people in the US die of heart disease every year. And most of the people in our study noted that 600,000 people seemed large in relation to the US population. So if your goal is to drive home the point that heart disease affects a lot of people, again, including the number might be a good idea. And then another thing we found was that when participants were looking at content that had a percentage versus content that had a frequency, some of them just really considered whether the intent of that content was for them to see the number as big or small. And lots of people indicated that frequencies really seem more personal and smaller than equivalent percentages. So if I said 3 out of 10, rather than saying 30%. So if you want your content to seem more personal and have people really relate to it, perhaps a frequency can help with that more than a percentage. So we also found that numbers lend credibility to health information. So when participants were reflecting on health content with numbers versus content without numbers, they consistently said this, that the numbers lend credibility, which wasn't necessarily something that we expected to hear. So this time, let's listen to an audio clip about this content on smoking. And I should note that, like the person you're going to hear in the clip, people in our study strongly preferred the numbers with context version, which is that one in the middle of your slide.
You know, other people could take this as an opinion type statement. It doesn't really have like any facts. Like how, once again, it gives you those numbers, and then it tells you, like, if you smoke, your risk of lung cancer is much higher than someone who doesn't smoke. Just kind of breaks it down, even, you know, makes it more clear for people to like really grasp what you're trying to say.
So that participant was basically saying that in the context-only version there on the right, that sentence, if you smoke, your risk of lung cancer is much higher than someone who doesn't smoke, could be perceived as an opinion because there are no numbers to back it up. And throughout our study, participants made statements that were really similar to that. Basically, when they reviewed content that included qualitative statements about magnitude, and so like much higher, but did not include numbers, many of them expressed doubt or some sort of desire for more detailed information. And then some people indicated that they perceived these statements might not be fact-based, or again, that they were opinions. And then other people noted that a number paired with a qualitative description of magnitude provided reassurance to them. Basically, it reassured them that the information that they were reading was believable. Okay, so next finding, people consistently in our study referred to numbers and health information as standing out in the text. And they meant that in a good way. I feel like you might be thinking that if a number stands out, then people are stumbling over it, which could actually decrease their understanding, of course. But that was not the case with the content that we tested. So let's listen to a clip where someone talks about second spelled out versus with the numeral 2.
I think that second reacts faster in your brain than reading the word second. I think seeing the 2, so you don't have to go through all 7 letters, or what is that, 6 letters? Yeah, it just is faster.
So as you heard, this participant indicated that numeral 2 in second stood out to him. And I will note that people in our study almost always preferred that numeric version of second rather than the fully spelled out word. They said the numeric version really caught their attention. And some people actually noted that they overlooked the fully spelled out version, or they said that it had a different meaning for them. For example, second can be a unit of time, which again, that wasn't necessarily something that we would have thought about. And then some people actually noted that numbers caused them to slow down and carefully reflect on a statement in a good way. Because again, we only had 1 or maybe 2 participants indicate that numbers slowed them down in a way that could suggest confusion. Mostly they were saying it was like, oh, it made me really think about this information in a good way. So people make sense of numbers through visualization. Now, sometimes we give people a very clear visual description, maybe a visual metaphor, but in our study, we found that when we did not provide a visual metaphor, people often were creating their own visual in their minds to help them understand the numbers. Now, the content on this slide does include a visual metaphor. It's that looks about the same size as a deck of cards. So at least the versions in the center and the right side of the screen do. So let's listen to someone explaining why that deck of cards metaphor in this example is helpful.
The deck of cards is very helpful.
Okay, what makes that helpful?
Because if you can vision a deck of cards, you can vision a piece of steak or fish or...
All right, so like this participant, many people said that seeing the number in their head helped them make it seem more tangible or concrete. But when a number itself was unfamiliar or difficult to visualize, almost all participants expressed appreciation for visual metaphors. And then we found that visual metaphors are particularly useful when the metaphor is familiar. I think no surprise there. We also found that people are creating visuals in their minds for frequencies and percentages. So what I mean by that, for frequencies, people often mention visualizing their families or maybe like people in a room and considering how many of them could be affected. So if we say 1 in 4 people have X disease, someone who has a family of 4 might picture their family and think, oh, that's like one of the people in my family having this disease. With percentages, though, a lot of people talked about picturing some kind of portion in a whole, like a pie chart, basically. And then staying on the topic of frequencies and percentages, this slide and the next one are related because they both have to do with percentages and frequencies. But let's start with the finding on this slide. In our study, people demonstrated that an important part of their being able to make meaning of numbers involved converting numbers to the format that they preferred. So for some people, that meant converting a percentage to a frequency, and then for others, it meant the opposite, converting a frequency to a percentage. And as you will see in this clip, the frequency 9 out of 10 was not this particular participant's preferred format. And I also want to note, because I know some of you will notice it, it's actually true that more than 9 out of 10 people who get the chickenpox vaccine never get chickenpox. I think it's 99% or something. So, but for the sake of simplifying this example, we just said 9 out of 10 rather than saying more than 9 out of 10, which can be a little confusing. And this participant noticed.
9 out of 10 is 90%. That leaves 10%. So what they're saying is that 10% of the people who get vaccinated still get chickenpox. And I know that's not accurate. But just, you know, like a 1.0847. I mean, just something more descriptive.
Gotcha.
Saying 9 out of 10 is worthless.
Gotcha. Okay.
So clearly that participant wanted to see a much more specific number and format than the frequency 9 out of 10. Let's actually take a look at the next slide before we talk more about people converting numbers to their preferred format. So in addition to the fact that people are often trying to convert frequencies to percentages and vice versa, we found that it's not super clear cut whether people generally understand frequencies or percentages better. In fact, they are often struggling to understand those numbers overall. And we do think that people's understanding of a percentage or frequency may depend in part on their ability to convert it to their preferred format. And it may also depend on any context provided with the numbers. So let's listen to actually 2 different participants' comments on the content that you see on this slide.
I think 3 out of 10 would give people a bit more picture of the whole thing instead of this 30%.
Okay, I'm going to look for more about that.
I think it would be easier to understand 3 out of 10. You know, it's going to be 3 or 4 people, where 30% would be millions.
So sorry, that participant I think had pet birds. And let's go on to the next one. And his audio quality is not great, but we will go over it afterwards.
Like I say, it's the percentage sounds more statistic. Like, I mean, both, like I say, both statistics, but it's like, I don't know. Just coming off of my brain, that 3 out of 10 sounds better. 30% is like, of what? You know, like, what is it? 300 out of, is it 30 out of 100, or is it out of 10?
So again, I know his audio quality wasn't great, but in a nutshell, he was really having trouble understanding what that 30% meant. And I don't know if you caught the first participant, she said 3 out of 10 would be 3 or 4 people, but 30% could be millions. So that also indicates that she may not have a great understanding of what those numbers mean. So in general, here's what we found about percentages and frequencies. When shown a frequency or percentage, like the ones on this slide, people consistently verbally converted them to suit their personal preference. People also tried to understand the frequency 9 out of 10, which was on the last slide, by translating it into a percentage, but sometimes they did that in a way that wasn't accurate. So some people said 9 out of 10 was like 99%. Some other people said almost 90%. As far as what they preferred, when people were shown both a percentage and a frequency together, they slightly favored frequencies. And then most participants were able to accurately assess percentages as being relatively high or low. But as I touched on earlier, several indicated that they perceive percentages to be a little abstract and less personally relevant. And then we also had an example that included 1 in 4 versus 25%. And interestingly, when people were shown 1 in 4, only a few verbally converted it to 25%. But when they were shown, and when people were shown 25%, no one converted it to 1 in 4. And in general, participants struggled to verbalize the relative size of the numbers in our 1 in 4 versus 25% example. And I should also note that some people thought that 3 out of 10 and 30% felt more interchangeable than 1 out of 4 and 25%, even though they knew that 1 out of 4 is the same as 25%. And finally, we definitely didn't see clearly that either frequencies or percentages are better for health materials. And we think it's an area where more research could be really helpful. I know we're coming to the end of our time. We just have one more finding here. So one of the things we were interested in when we started this study was the idea that if we provide really good context for something that we're communicating, can we leave the number out? And the answer is basically no. Our last major finding was that participants almost always indicated that the examples of health information that included both numbers and context were the most clear and the most helpful for decision making. So in this example, people strongly favored the middle version that gives a number with context, including a range. So let's listen.
It's telling you the range and not just saying your level was. It's telling you the range. Mm-hmm. Help you. That way you can see how far, how close you are in the range. I'm gonna say the second one because it's giving you the scale and then it's giving you your level.
So that participant talked a lot about the range, and that's important to note because context can be provided using words like low risk or in the form of additional numbers like a range. So in this air quality index example you're seeing here, people really said that the range helped them make meaning of the numbers. This was also true. We had a triglyceride example where we gave people a number. We said it was their triglyceride number and it was unhealthy. And if we gave them the range of unhealthy numbers, that really gave them a frame of reference and helped them understand it better. And I'm going to move us on since we are so close to the end here. So what now? Basically, our research findings support the idea that as health communicators, we make some assumptions about numbers that are considered tried and true, but that are actually kind of fuzzy. So after we finished our study, we came up with some numeracy guidance that basically elaborates on that existing guidance that we talked about earlier, and that we think could be really helpful for anyone who creates health materials. So let's take a look at some of those. So our first key takeaway is that you need to carefully consider whether numbers are useful before you include them in a health material. And we framed it this way on purpose because we don't want to say avoid numbers whenever possible, since we know that numbers sometimes can be very useful. And then we especially want people to consider whether numbers will help support their main message or communication goal. If they can do that, probably a good call to include them. The next key takeaway is that it is a good idea to use numerals rather than spelled out numbers. This is something that we already did as a best practice. A lot of you probably do that as well. But this isn't always mentioned in numeracy guidance. And so with our research confirming that it makes sense to use numerals rather than spelled out numbers, we just want to make that really explicit. The next key finding, which we really just talked about a couple of slides ago, is that when you're using numbers in a health material, provide context. And again, that context can come in the form of words or additional numbers, which kind of runs counter to what some of us are taught. Sometimes you actually want more numbers, especially when we're talking about a range. Ranges can be a really helpful way to provide context for people. And you see one of the examples on this slide gives a range. The other one is providing context with words. Final key takeaway is that it's a good idea to consider using visual metaphors. This is probably not surprising. This goes back to the finding that when we did not provide a visual metaphor, people were finding their own way to visualize numbers. So if we can help them visualize, we are ultimately helping them understand the number and then understand the health material. It's of course important to try to choose metaphors that are familiar to your audience. The one on the slide is probably familiar to most people. People know how big dice are. I came across one that said, one slice of bread is about the same size as a cassette tape. I would recommend that as one not to use if you're communicating with an audience that's pretty young. All right, so those are our key takeaways, and Sandy is going to quickly talk about our ideas for future research.
Yeah, so of course, this really, I think, uncovered maybe more questions even, but led us down some interesting paths. One thing that we didn't look at, because we were only looking at small excerpts, were, a lot of the guidance says, don't use a lot of numbers, use numbers sparingly. And we're not exactly sure where that cut point is. I mean, obviously it's going to depend on the purpose of the material and your main message. But is there a point where people really start to just skip over numbers? We know from other kinds of research that numbers can start to overwhelm people. It can trigger skipping of text. In our study with short examples, people seem to like the numbers being there for the most part, but we'd like to dive into that a little bit more in the context of a whole like fact sheet or web page or something like that. Also looking a little bit more on the risk concepts in general and the formats for presenting numerical health risk information. I think by and large, risk is super complicated. It was the hardest concept for people to get. They really struggled with both the risk examples we gave. There wasn't as clear of a preference or as clear of understanding on the risk pieces. So I think there's more to be done. There's obviously a lot in the risk communication literature about this, but I think where numbers are at play, there's more to be done there. And then finally, this piece around frequencies and percentages is really interesting. I think in general, as material developers, we're usually told to use the frequency. I mean, that's the kind of guidance, the general, what we're told that, 1 in 4 or whatever is better to use, or, 5 out of 10. And we saw that, people were really struggling a little bit with both, or they were converting back and forth between the two. And I think obviously this is where that overlap in calculation starts to come in. You heard that example where the woman was, trying to extrapolate, well, what does 30% mean? That could be millions versus, 3 out of 10, that's just a few people. There is some mathematical things that people have to do, and like how much context or additional information. I know one person suggested, what if you put in both? Does that help? Like if you tell people, and we actually talked about this internally, putting in the percentage and the frequency side by side, and what does that do? Does that help or confuse? I think there's a lot more to do there. So this is really interesting stuff. And I again want to really thank National Library of Medicine, and in particular Stephanie Morrison and Laura Bartlett at NLM for being interested in this work and giving us the chance to dive into it a little bit more. And we're hoping, to continue down this path a little bit more. But with that, we'll pause and see what other questions you guys have, and feel free to chat in there. We've been trying to answer as we go as well. Yeah, there's a question in here right now, Andrea, about efficacy numbers, like how well medication works. We didn't test this exact concept in this testing for a couple of different reasons, but we did see it a little bit in the chickenpox example that Andrea showed. I don't know if Andrea, you want to talk about that a little bit more, because we did scratch the surface a little bit on this.
Yeah, and one thing, and I can't speak to it too much, but one thing that we found, we initially talked about having a whole other health communication concept that was about efficacy. But what we were finding was that it's so similar to risk, because if you're saying what the efficacy of something is, it's almost like you're saying the risk of not getting something. So it's like those things go hand in hand. So I think our risk findings really apply to efficacy as well. And so, as Sandy mentioned too, risk is just complicated in general, and I think needs more research. And so I think this this ties into that as well. And I don't know that we have anybody have any other questions. I know we went a few minutes over, so thank you for those of you who stuck around with us. We appreciate it. Any other closing thoughts, Sandy?
I don't think so, but I appreciate, this format. It's always interesting. I can't see all your faces, but I appreciate everybody coming and listening, and looking forward to more discussion on this.
Thanks, everybody.